I'd like to share. In case of an emergency, please exit through the nearest door and follow the illuminated signs. To the goodness of acoustics in this room, we all gonna need to project our voice so we can hear us all. On your table, so I'll greatly appreciate your feedback. And also, please limit any side conversation to minimize our acoustic challenges. For those joining virtually, today's agenda and meeting materials are available on our website at www.results.wa.gov, and a link to the event recording will be available soon. With that, I want to share the purpose of today's meeting. The Public Performance Review is an opportunity for Governor to hear from state agencies and community partners about the progress and ongoing challenges with addressing homelessness and the housing crisis, and also to hear from those impacted by this work. So homelessness and housing crisis are linked directly to Governor's strategic goal for healthy and safe communities. Now let me walk us through the agenda and introduce our panel. Agenda is divided into 4 segments. To my very far right, we'll start our first segment by hearing from Ted Kelleher with Department of Commerce. And Ted will discuss the overview of homelessness and housing. And Nate Lichty, both with the Department of Commerce. Ann and Nate will speak to growth management and investments made and outcomes achieved in this space. Next to Nate is Debbie Driver, Governor's Senior Policy Advisor. And next to Debbie and to my immediate right is, of course, Governor Inslee. For third segment, we'll start by hearing from Ted Kelleher with Department of Commerce, Steve Rourke to my immediate right with the Department of Transportation, and our guest, Sean Watkins with King County Homelessness Authority. For fourth and final segment, we'll hear from Diane Clones with Department of Commerce, and our presenter will cover these efforts, successes, and challenges in greater detail. Now, before we get started, Governor, we'll look forward to hearing your opening remarks, sir.
Thank you. I'm very interested in our discussion today because this is one of the greatest challenges of the state of Washington. We have such a great state, but we know we have so many Washingtonians who are ill-housed, and we have been working on this diligently for several years. I think that our meeting today is emblematic of what we do in Washington, which is to continually improve and never be satisfied. We have had a significant success in building new housing in the last few years. We've had significant success in providing people a better mental health treatment that they need to remain stable in housing. We've had considerable success getting additional chemical addiction treatment for people, but not enough. And so this is a meeting to discuss our greater ambitions and our demand for future progress. So we want to look at today to talk about what is working and is going to work to guide us in the future. I want to say this at the outset, though. Homelessness is fundamentally a housing crisis. We have to have more housing in the state of Washington. And I say that because you might think that's a no-brainer, but it is fundamental for solving this problem. We've got to build more housing in the state of Washington. We're going to talk about the support systems that are also important for people who have had considerable challenges. But we have to build more roofs in the state of Washington in order to solve this problem. And in part because we're such a successful state, because everybody wants to live in the state of Washington. We've had 1 million people move here in the last decade and a half, and we have a whole bunch more coming in the future. So I look forward to every idea we have today on how we can continue that building enterprise. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Governor. Now we'll start with our first segment by hearing from Ted Kelleher. Ted is Housing Policy Director with the Housing Division within the Washington State Department of Commerce. Ted, please.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for convening this exploration of affordable housing and homelessness. The good news is we know more than ever how to make housing affordable and how to bring people inside. But achieving those goals is not easy. It takes focus and investments, and we're going to be talking about some of that today and some of the success we've had. To kick off today's conversation, I'm going to start by providing some context regarding Washington's constrained housing market, which is not the only factor, but it's a key factor driving the affordability and homelessness crisis we're facing. A foundational issue is housing construction in Washington State has not kept pace with population growth experienced over the last decade. Depending on how you measure it, Washington is short about 100,000 units of housing. This chart shows historic housing unit permits since 1990. So these are permits. This is a common way of measuring construction. At least 55,000 units need to be built each year to address housing demand. That's that green line. Actual units permitted met the target in 2022. You can see that blue line hitting the target, but have again fallen below the target rate after interest rates were increased by the Federal Reserve. So we're seeing this all across the country. We're at an unprecedented low level of adding units right now. Currently, Washington is adding 37,000 housing units per year, 18,000 short of the annual target of 55,000. So to be clear, this is all housing units, the private sector, public sector, all housing units being added. Changes made in the last two legislative sessions for land use and other issues should at least partially address this growing shortfall, but more should be considered. Supply alone will not address the affordability crisis. At scale, housing subsidies are needed in any scenario, but addressing affordability without adequate supply for practical purposes is impossible. A separate but related issue is that 316,000 very low-income households are paying more than 50% of their income for housing. There are different measures of affordability. You'll hear different measures and different numbers. This is a very conservative measure of low-income houses paying more than 50% of what income they have for rent. This very conservative measure shows that roughly 10% of Washington households are struggling to pay for housing, putting them at severe risk of homelessness. So it's not all bad news. There's some nuance I want to speak to the housing affordability problem in Washington. For households with median incomes in 2022, this is median, right in the middle, housing was affordable and affordability was not getting worse. This slide shows the ratio of median housing costs to median incomes has been stable, 24% in 2010 to 22% in 2022. Now this is census data only through 2022. Obviously there's been some changes more recently that changed this portrait, but definitionally looking at the median in an aggregate data set leaves people out at the margins. During this time, some people maintained affordability by moving to lower cost areas in their community, another county, or out of state. They were displaced. And this data does not include the recent unaffordability for first-time home purchases driven by those Federal Reserve interest rate increases. So the prices have remained stable, but the interest rates have gone up, so the payments are that much higher. This mismatch between incomes, housing purchase prices, and interest rates is extreme and well outside of the long-term historical trend and unlikely to be sustained. Something's got to give. Prices, interest rates, something's got to give. But for many people directly engaged in Washington's dynamic growing economy with a full-time job in this dynamic economy, housing has remained affordable, as you see from remaining roughly at between 24 and 21% of income spent on housing costs. Another cut at this data, if you're working full-time minimum wage, it's not that housing is affordable. Generally, you only want to pay 30% of your income for housing, so at 42%, it's not affordable. But it's been stable because we have a pretty solid minimum wage in Washington State that's tracked with housing prices. You'll see between 42 and 43% there. But this is just a slice of the picture, not a complete picture, but I think this is an important subgroup to look at. For people with fixed incomes, it has not kept pace with the housing price increases, unlike the previous two slides we looked at. For people with low incomes, such as those on fixed incomes, affordability is deteriorating. This graph shows that although the federal disability income increases with the overall inflation rate, the cost of housing has increased faster than inflation. In 2010, the average lower cost rental in Washington, these are lower cost rentals, not the median, these are the lower end, lower quintile, cost 89% of the $8,000 that federal disability paid. So that math it's hard, right? At 80% of that disability payment, it's hard, but at least mathematically possible. In 2022, it consumed, that disability payment was rent was 124% of that disability payment. So individuals being creative can make the situation work when they're in disability, but in aggregate terms, when you've made it that much harder, you're going to see more people at risk and experiencing homelessness. And as you can see, the trend in homelessness has increased in Washington. There's different ways of measuring it. This is using an administrative data set that's fairly reliable. In general, higher rents are associated with higher levels of homelessness. In a higher rent environment, below average rental vacancies, people struggling for whatever reason have a harder time piecing together a way to stay inside. In a higher rent environment, a family crisis, a job loss, a behavioral health issue, including opioid dependence, those issues are more likely to push you into homelessness in a tighter, higher rent environment. States with much higher levels of poverty and substance use disorder have lower rates of homelessness, largely because they have plentiful low-cost housing options, better matched to disability payments and other low incomes. I want to speak briefly to some of the dynamic. I mean, a lot of the dynamic we're seeing is actual and overall increase in homelessness driven by that rents, but there is an issue with visible homelessness. In recent years, more people have been seen living outside. I know most of us in our day-to-day life have seen more people living outside. Much of that is driven by the overall increase in people who are experiencing homelessness. But a meaningful portion of what we see on our streets, parks, and highways is driven by federal court rulings that limit sanctions. Longstanding practices were ruled illegal, and some people living unsheltered who were previously hidden are now more visible than they were historically. I want to speak briefly to the racial disparities in homelessness. Long-standing, the legacy of racism and explicitly racist housing policies damaged our housing situation for people from historically marginalized communities. We're working to address this by measuring equity in our housing programs. We require equitable results as a condition of receiving funding, making the issue seen and transparent, and then holding ourselves and others accountable to doing better, and providing technical assistance, including assistance and funding to by and for organizations to help expand the pool of people providing services. We're not where we need to be, but we're working towards a more equitable system. We have performance-based contracting. Commerce's housing programs operate under a nation-leading performance management framework. Performance benchmarks are set in contracts. This is all on a website. You can drill down to counties and individual organizations, see their performance. In general, when these programs have a capacity to serve someone, they're performing in line with what you see nationally. But when about half the people living outside are mostly not served at all, the overall outcome is increased homelessness. So just to summarize, what the research and data says, we know what works. Working at scale and across systems is critical. Land use reforms are critical. There has to be enough places for people to live in any scenario. Addressing poverty can be part of the solution. The 10-year plan to dismantle poverty includes ideas like education and direct cash transfers that could help. But in any scenario, success can only be attained by scaling up the supply of subsidized units. It's just a fundamental, we need enough places through land use, and we need subsidies layered in to make it work. And then for many people, we need supportive services layered into that housing because they need more than the subsidy. They need the support they need to stay stably housed in their community. Thank you.
Do you have any thoughts or comments for Ted?
Yeah, can we put that last slide up again? I just want to look at, of those items to see what we've done in the state of Washington. If you could just put up that last slide we were looking at, whoever runs the Technology Center of the state of Washington. Our remotes are too remote here. We're going to the old-fashioned, there we go. I just want to look at this to see what we've done in the state of Washington as a checklist. So allow increased density. Our legislature last session passed a law that allows increased density. I think that's been a good thing. We've taken action on this. There's more action needed. Next year, I hope the legislature looks at our transit-oriented development bill yet again. That needs to pass so that we can have increased density near transit centers, and I look forward to that getting done. We made real progress on that in the last 2 years, socializing legislators to this idea, but they're going to need to get that across the finish line. Increasing incomes has been an important part of our effort. We've done our earned income tax credit, which has been an unprecedented tax relief for lower income people, which in effect has increased real incomes. We have a high minimum wage, so we have taken action when it comes to increasing incomes. And I'm pleased by looking at the median incomes have gone up dramatically on a slide that we'll look at in a minute. Building subsidized units, we've had an unprecedented investment in the state of Washington in publicly funded subsidized units. It is well beyond anything Washington has ever done, and I'm proud of that work. And it has increased every single year, I believe, in the last 5 or 6 years while I have been governor. Our housing vouchers is one of our strategies that we're doing. And our last thing is something that is kind of the silent success we've had of comprehensive supports for those who need help. And this has been one of the secrets of success, that we have had a high percentage of success. If you look at our right-of-way initiatives, if you drive up from here to Everett, you're going to see a lot less homelessness encampments, like a lot less. Like there's just not a lot left between here and Everett right now. It's been a very significant success. And the secret of that success is our state has provided support for people not only getting a roof over their head, but getting the mental health treatment they need and the chemical addiction treatment they need so they stay in that unit. And our success rate is over 80%, which is incredible in this field to have a success rate to keep people housed in this regard. So the point I want to make is if you look at the things that works, we've done some semblance of everything in the state of Washington, and I'm proud of the efforts we've made, but we've got a lot more work to do. Can we go back to, I think it might be the second slide, it showed median incomes versus affordability, and it basically was showing for median income folks. So if you look at this slide, I think there's something to be said about it that's not obvious. If you look at the middle income have kept pace with housing costs. Obviously, that doesn't solve the problem for those in the lower income brackets, which we need help with. The point I want to make is that even if middle incomes have kept pace with housing costs, we have to build more what I call middle income housing so that the folks in the middle aren't driving rents up too fast for the folks in the lower end can't afford rent. And I think this is a really important point. We can't solve this problem by only building lower income housing. Because if we don't build middle income housing, the middle income folks don't have a place to live and they just drive up the rents, and the lower income folks don't have a place to live. This is an important point. It is obscure, but one I hope legislators pay attention to in the future. We have to build middle income housing as well as low income housing to solve this problem. Otherwise, we just have low-income people squeezed out of the hard housing market by all the brilliant computer scientists who are moving here, and brilliant physicists and brilliant chemists. So, important point going forward. I don't want it to be lost. And Ted, I have to tell you, to see your smiling face every time we close a homelessness encampment is a real joy. I want to thank you for your work. We're having significant success. We have more to do, obviously, but thanks for your leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Ted. For our second segment, we'll hear from Ann Fritzel, Housing Planning Manager, Growth Management Services, and Nate Lichty, Managing Director, Housing Division, and both with the Department of Commerce. So, Ann, please.
Thank you. My name is Ann Fritzel. I'm the Housing Section Manager within the Growth Management Services. So I'm going to speak about recent land use legislation and the housing supply side of the issue. The 2021 legislative session produced legislation to direct our unit to project housing needs for the state. We took the median population projection for each county from the Office of Financial Management and considered existing housing shortages, a decrease in household size for most counties, healthy vacancy rates, and recreational homes not available for year-round housing. And we found we need more than a million new homes over the next 20 years, above the 3 million that we currently have. Then we took the income data from the census and determined how much housing is needed at each income bracket. This is a graphic that we created that has housing types to illustrate what types of housing are needed for different incomes. On the right are the higher income homes. The private market will provide mainly as single-family homes or townhomes, and this housing can occur in most residential zones. In orange is the housing needed for low and moderate income households. With moderate density zoning and incentives, the private market may be able to provide some of this housing, most likely as ownership. On the left is the 500,000 homes that are needed for the lowest earning households in the state. Here, multifamily zoning will be needed, generally within urban areas which offer public transportation and services, and significant subsidies will be needed. We also projected that we will continue to need emergency housing beds, as there's always be friction. Next, only the 28 fully planning counties in the state under the Growth Management Act are required to allocate their county's share of housing to municipalities based on available land, sewer, and water capacity, and for regional housing goals. And then they must plan for and accommodate housing for all. This is language from the revised Growth Management Act housing goal. Even jurisdictions that are not required to develop a full comprehensive plan under the Growth Management Act are developing plans like this to address housing shortages that continue in every corner of the state. Comprehensive plans and regulations are the driving tool to address housing. Cities and counties are not required to build this housing, but they must ensure an adequate supply of appropriately zoned land and consider incentives to assure there is an opportunity for all needed housing to be developed. We currently have a grant program to help regional coordination in planning for the lowest income segments. The housing element must also make adequate provisions to identify barriers to housing development, and local governments must begin to undo discriminatory zoning by allowing new housing in areas of opportunity, such as large lot zoning and employment areas, and review priorities for infrastructure investment to be equitable. State rules on housing have changed a lot in recent years. Most local governments must allow emergency and permanent supportive housing in residential areas. Many communities are adjusting their zoning to do so, and we are preparing a model ordinance to help provide more guidance about removing barriers to these important housing types. All urban growth areas must allow 2 accessory dwelling units per lot where possible, and our larger cities must allow middle housing. There's also an expectation of significant upzoning to leverage public transit investments. This variety of housing options and increased capacity will likely offer opportunities for people to move about in the housing market, freeing up units, particularly at the higher end, but throughout the housing spectrum. At the lower level, more public support at all levels of government, along with other partners, will be necessary. And finally, the legislature has provided unprecedented levels of funding for local land use planning recently, because this is the first step in getting to adequate housing. By the dates shown on the map, each county and each city must update their comprehensive plan and associated development regulations, planning for enough housing so that every household can have a place to call home. And I'd like to turn this over to Nate to talk about state investments in housing.
Thanks, Ann. Ann described the layout of the land and the system that we use in building the housing that we need. Since 1986, the state's Housing Trust Fund has been the cornerstone of the state's investment in low-income housing. Where the state's investment starts leads the way to where the rest of the public lenders put their resources in, and private equity comes in to help support the system. Since 1986, the trust funds invested over $2 billion in capital funding to create 60,000 units of affordable housing. As you see, a majority of that investment has occurred here in the last 5 years. Our annual investments were producing about 2,000, between 2,000 and 2,500 units per year, per biennium. But with the record investments in 21 to 23, which included $400 million for rapid capital housing, made us able to impact 9,000 impacted units. These investments adjust annually with special provisos from each capital budget. Increasingly, our focus is on providing permanent housing solutions, including those with services and, most importantly, innovations in health and housing with the expansion of foundational community supports and the healthcare authority. In the most recent historic investment that was made by the state, we were able to, in the first year of the biennium, we announced investments of $313 million. My colleague Ann Campbell manages the homeownership unit, and they invested a record $38 million in homeownership, which really expands the continuum of housing. They created, they invested in 18 projects and are creating 470 homeownership units. In multifamily housing, we participated in a multi-jurisdictional competitive round with the Housing Finance Commission. This was the first year that our funding was fully able to align with the commission and their tax credit investments, and we were also able to invest in projects that they were not able to get to. We awarded $274 million out of the 352 that we had available, in creating over $1.5 billion of affordable housing investments in 48 projects, creating 3,400 housing units. 1/3 of these investments are serving homeless and extremely low-income households, those most vulnerable. And we're also increasing the quality of permanent supportive housing through coordination with the Office of Apple Health and Home, which coordinates the interagency cooperation on housing and health care. Unfortunately, we had to decline 44 projects that have readiness, local funding commitments, but we ran out of resources to align with those. Importantly, on a racial equity, from a racial equity lens, we have also been piloting and using a by and for definition to help invest in organizations that are operated by and by the communities that they serve. These are culturally based, directed, and substantially controlled organizations that serve most impacted communities, those most impacted by homelessness, BIPOC, those with disabilities, refugees, persons fleeing violence, etc. This is an example on your screen is the beloved Sunset Apartments in Spokane. This is a rapid capital project that we were able to invest in last year prior to the by and for designation and process for certification. This is a grassroots organization that has deep commitment and longstanding service in homeless services, and this is the first opportunity for them to own and operate a property. Ownership matters, and taking care of their constituents and knowing what they need is really important. We invested in 7 by and for organizations this current round, including El Centro de la Raza, First AME Housing in Seattle, the Tulalip Tribes, and more. Now, to the scale of the investment that we're looking for, as you saw, the scale has been increasing substantially, but tying together with Ann's presentation, we are projecting that we need 26,000 housing units for very low-income households each year. We were able to produce 3,400 units, which is 13% of the total. And we need to, we were looking at what was successful, which regions were successful, what they did. Most of them had diverse project types. They sought multiple different fund sources, and they really coordinated locally. So these traits are things that we're trying to expand upon in producing and expanding the supply of low-income housing. And I'll wrap up, conclude there.
Thank you, Nate. Thank you, Ann. Gordon, do you have any thoughts or
Thank you.
comments?
Could we put the graph up? There was a graph there showing growth management issues. There was a large lot issue. I wanted to ask about if somebody could effort to make that come up here again. Keep going, keep going. Hold on, right here. Okay, this is great. I wanted to make sure I understand beginning to undo discriminatory zoning by allowing new housing areas of opportunity such as large lot zoning. I assume you mean reducing the large lot zoning. Is that you're saying?
So looking at red line areas and large lots as exclusionary.
So that was a historic, we're still suffering the historic discrimination that went on through the zoning code is what you're saying. And we're fixing that, right? Thank you. What about employment areas? What are you referring to on this graph?
So when we talk about putting housing in areas of opportunity, we want to make sure that we're providing for more affordable housing in areas where there are jobs and that there's transportation and things that people need to be successful in life, schools, parks, and not that we're not choosing to make investments in areas that don't have so many opportunities.
So one of the suggestions here is a possibility of expedited permitting. I'm not sure we've succeeded in that yet. Do we have any expedited permitting strategies in place yet?
We do 5290 passed this year and providing significant resources to our department to assist with increasing permitting speeds, helping bring modernized permitting departments, some still using old paper. But this is incentive specifically for low income. It's a way to, cities can look at housing needs and they can choose to prioritize low income projects or projects that are more affordable by offering waivers and exemptions. Those are authorized in state law. They can offer density bonuses and speed up the permitting, walk through specific projects.
Well, I am really excited about success of this because the permitting adds huge cost to construction costs while that money's sitting on the sideline waiting. So I hope this is a success. I think this can reduce the cost of housing significantly. One more issue here. I wonder if I wanted, well, just a comment on zoning and our growth management. It's great to have improvements in zoning, but that can be stymied if we have a lack of local leadership that actually will cite and permit these projects. We need local leaders to have the courage to work with their communities to get buy-in to build low-income housing, to build mental health units, to build chemical addiction treatment centers. And sometimes we haven't had that local leadership. We've had people who have listened to just people who've expressed concern that might represent 0.5% of their constituency, and they don't listen to the 99% of their constituency who want to have low-income housing. And they collapse like a house of cards in somebody shaking their fist at them. And as a result, we don't get these places cited. We need local leadership to have courage to recognize that the vast majority of our constituents want to have housing and mental health solutions in our state. And I encourage everybody to encourage our local leaders to demonstrate that courage. If they demonstrate courage, they'll find success because the vast majority of their constituents want to help solve this problem. And listening to those people is important, not just to the loudest voices in the room. So if you have a chance to give an attaboy and add a woman to local leaders who help cite these facilities, that would be wonderful. We need that courage. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Ann, and thank you, Nate, again. So now we'll start with the third segment, and in this segment, we'll hear from, again, Ted Kelleher, a Housing Policy Director with Washington State Department of Commerce, and to my immediate left, Steve Rourke, Regional Administrator with Washington State Department of Transportation, and third, our guest, Sean Watkins, with Senior Policy Advisor with King County Homelessness Authority. So Ted, please lead the way.
Next, I'm going to talk about the encampment resolution program as an example of how strong partnerships backed by adequate funding can successfully move people inside. We know how to do this work. We know how to bring people inside if we're working together and bringing resources at scale. Started in 2022 under the governor's leadership and very clear direction, giving the agencies the flexibility to work in new ways. The program brought together state and local organizations with a focus on moving people inside who were living on encampments along state highways. We found new ways to work with one another, set aside historic practices. How do we get this done? We've got the resources, we've got the flexibility, we know we can do this. And one of the goals, one of the primary goals as directed in the legislation was that it wasn't just, classically, you can move people off a site, but you're just pushing them to another site. This was a really different initiative to actually bring people inside. And the partnerships would not have worked without adequate funding for outreach to engage people living in the camps, assessing their needs, funding for expanded shelter and housing, including converting a number of old hotels that are going to serve their communities for the next at least 40 years as a community resource beyond this initiative, funding for cleaning up the sites and improving them to prevent people from moving back, and funding for ongoing monitoring to engage people before they establish a camp near a freeway. It also was an opportunity to bring other partners to the solution, bringing in all the state agencies that can play a role. As seen in this picture, we had employees from Department of Licensing, Department of Health, and DSHS, actually state employees coming on site to the camp, engaging with people, getting them the ID and the benefits they need to help them on their journey towards housing stability and recovery. Boots on the ground partnerships like these were once novel, but they've become more routine. We're investigating how to work together in other ways. For instance, licensing is looking at reducing the cost of IDs and additional ways of bringing services directly to people instead of requiring everyone to come into an office. We can all play a role in this effort, all the state agencies. The encampment resolution program, this site's actually out of date. There's more sites resolved, but it's 34 sites, more than 1,000 people moved inside. And 83% of those found on the typical sites moved into shelter or housing. Other encampment clearing efforts were less focused on that really pushing people inside as opposed to pushing them around. Typically report about 15% of people actually come into shelter. We're above 83%, well above the average. As we learn more, we want to do even better, but that's well above average. Here's a map, again, out of date, but because there's even more sites are addressed every day, it's a very dynamic situation. There are additional sites in these 5 counties. Many are harder to access, smaller sites. We're on track to address 5 additional sites by the end of April. It's always complicated, but each site's different, but we'll see if we can get there. And yeah, thank you for everyone, the partners here today. It really was a partnership, and we've really learned so much more. And this goes beyond encampments, the whole effort to address homelessness. We've learned so much.
Thank you, Ted. Steve, please.
Yeah, a lot of coordination, planning, and effort goes into the encampment resolution program, and those efforts, as Ted mentioned, are producing results. Examples you see here from King, Thurston, and Spokane counties, and I would add that we have similar successes at all 5 of our ERP counties across the state. DOT's role, we have several primary responsibilities. DOT identifies the sites during the outreach phase. We're coordinating with service providers on needs and best approaches to address each site. Once a site is vacant, WSDOT takes on a lead role in removing debris and making site modifications. And sorry, these can, oftentimes, you look at some of these sites, and these can be extensive efforts spread out over several days and sometimes weeks, often involving large equipment to get the work done. And regarding modifications, we use a least cost, least invasive approach. We have a baseline approach that applies to every site that involves really vegetation trimming to make sure we have good sight lines. And if repopulation is anticipated or becomes an issue, we assess the use of additional measures. And throughout all these, as has been mentioned, we're working closely with our partners at Commerce, the State Patrol, our service providers, and local government. And lastly, I wanted to just touch quickly on monitoring. Once a site is cleared, we have the mission of monitoring these sites in conjunction with law enforcement and our partners. Site clearing and repair. I mean, we're out there monitoring sites. It often brings in maintenance to make sure these sites are kept up to date with vegetation control and whatnot. And addressing long-term concerns, there's a lot of sites in the ERP outside of the areas we're currently working in. Those areas are not, the local agencies there don't have the resources to necessarily take on some of the planning and all that. And so funding to do those sort of things is certainly something that would be beneficial, but of course that would take additional resources and a lot of planning with those, to bring those partnerships to bear to make this successful. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sean.
Thanks, Steve. So in King County, as you can see by the graphic, we have to date resolved 11 encampments, major encampments along state right-of-ways, which have resulted in over 360 people coming indoors. And as Ted was talking about, our acceptance rate to housing currently in King County is 89%, which is really fantastic. 89% of folks engaged do come inside to either permanent housing or a temporary shelter. Kind of our approach in King County, we have made significant investments in permanent housing options on the back end. Nearly all of our funding from the Encampment Resolution Program is used to acquire and operate permanent housing options. To date, we have acquired one building and have master leased two additional buildings to offer permanent supportive housing to folks that were previously living in the right-of-way. And we have a third master lease that we're kind of working our way through now. All total, that will result in over 200 units of permanent housing for folks that were previously living unsheltered in the right-of-way. Our outreach program is pivotal in our ability to achieve these kind of success numbers. And so being able to provide longitudinal outreach over a period of weeks, not days, for our outreach teams to go out and engage with folks in the right-of-way, learn who they are, learn what their specific needs are, and best place those folks in our different resources has been extremely helpful. And it's important to note that we don't post a site for resolution until everybody on that location, when we first engaged there, has a housing plan in place. So this requires a lot of coordination multi-jurisdictionally between City of Seattle, WSDOT, Department of Commerce, all of the contractors that go into this. And so partnership has been pivotal in our ability to resolve this many encampments and have these kind of numbers. And so we are going to have a special presentation today by Sarah Eskew. Sarah was a participant, or is currently a participant, in our encampment resolution program. But first, I just want to talk a little bit about CoLead. CoLead is one of our contracted providers. They support people who are unhoused, who are at high risk of law enforcement involvement. They were established during the spring of 2020 during the COVID emergency, and they do a lot of intensive work with the participants of the Encampment Resolution Program. And so if we could have that presentation, please.
My name is Sarah Eskew. I have been swept once before when I was living in a tent with my ex in front of Whole Foods in Capitol Hill. The people that were helping us out to get housing really didn't do a very good job, and we didn't get into, we had to find our own, another place to go put up another tent. The CoLead program has, I guess, have certain employees that come through all the different encampments throughout Seattle, and they bring food in the morning, and they find us. Somehow they find us. When the resolution through CoLead happened, not only were they out every day making sure that we had something to eat in the morning, but they were talking to us, giving us resources, and giving us time. That was so important, because we're all doing our own thing, living our life, and they understood that. My biggest accomplishment was going to the pre-apprentice training program through CoLead, but the next one is my sobriety. So I have my certification to be a flagger, not just in Washington State, but throughout the whole United States. So I was told that I graduated at the top of my class. Which is so. Like I said in my speech, I can actually say I'm proud of myself. I'm going to be working with difficulty in getting into permanent housing. I already filled out an application, and so just, should be any day now that she'd be able to move in, and I've really accomplished a lot of goals, and one big goal, and that is to be on my own feet.
And folks, Sarah's been great to join us down here today. Sarah, why don't you stand up? Let's give Sarah a round of applause.
Program has been successful. When Sarah says she feels proud of herself, this is really wonderful, Sarah. It's really great to see your story. I look forward to helping our Department of Transportation in its efforts to improve our transportation system. So this is good news. Good luck. Thanks for sharing your story. We really appreciate it. I think Sarah's story is emblematic of what we did here on this right-of-way encampment program, which is instead of just chasing people from I-5 over to Carkeek Park or Woodland Park Zoo, we got them opportunities in housing like Sarah has experienced. And I think that was a right decision. It was right from a personal value system. It's right from an economic system, instead of just chasing people from place to place all the time, to actually solve the problem. And I'm glad to see we've had substantial success. I want to address an issue about the cost of this program. People have asked questions about this because most things that count, aren't free, and this program is not free. There are expenses of cleaning up, which are substantial in some of these areas. We've had hundreds of tons of cleanup to do, and we have to hire people and backhoes to do it. But most importantly, we need housing, and you need to go out and buy and build housing. And to do that, that's in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you don't have a house, you can't solve the problem. And we have to buy housing, we have to build housing, and to get a building housing unit in Western Washington anywhere is hundreds of thousands of dollars. So when people see a price tag of hundreds of thousands of dollars to get a people housed, here's why. It's because that's how much it costs to build a house or an apartment in Western Washington. And when we do that, that is not just a month's rent. People say, well, geez, you can get a month's rent for a couple $1,000s, right? It's not just a month's rent. It's buying a house that people can live in for 100 years. And many people will live in that house probably through multiple generations. So these are not small ticket items, but they are necessary investments to solve this problem. And I think we're seeing substantial success in this regard. So Ted, Steve, I asked legislators for some dollars. They came up with some, but not as much as we would have liked. Kind of how long can we, with the existing appropriation we did get, how long can we keep this program going, just on the right-of-way initiative, with the appropriation we were able to acquire? Any projections on this?
The good news is that we have that established housing that's going to be available for 40 years, and that's contractually available. So as people rotate out of that housing, and they already are, that there'll be some capacity at the margins. As I spoke to, we're on track to deal with an additional 5 sites through the end of April, if all things go as planned. But after that, frankly, it gets pretty tough because the legislature did not provide the level of financing. On the housing side, is an issue. I'm in some ways even more worried about our partners at WashDOT and the State Patrol. So I'll turn over to Steve because it's a tough situation.
Yeah, the $2 million we received in the budget, I mean, we'd hoped for more. We'd hoped for something closer to 10 million. It is going to limit our ability to address new sites. Certainly from a staffing standpoint, we're going to be able to monitor the sites that have been addressed in the ERP, but doing more is going to be challenging.
Well, I don't want to diminish what the legislature has done, but future legislators may have to revisit this issue to keep this program going. By the way, I just want to compliment DOT, the State Patrol, and others that have been very successful to prevent the reestablishment of these camps. I drive I-5 a lot, and I'm seeing a really high percentage of success where we're maintaining hygienic conditions on our roadways. It's been very, very successful, and I think it's a wise investment, so we just have to go through this same exercise again. So thanks for DOT on your planning. I think you've done things that are aesthetically very pleasing, actually, and are functionally working. I want to thank the State Patrol for their continuing monitoring of these sites. And the hardworking people who do this work. This is hard work, cleaning up these sites, and I've seen them, and I want to thank them for their hard work as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Ted, Steve, and Sean. And thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us here today and sharing your inspiring journey. Thank you. I wish you the very best. Thank you. For our fourth and final segment, we'll hear from Diane Clons to my very far left. And Diane is Deputy Director with the Department of Commerce. Diane, please.
Thank you. And thank you, Governor, for your years of support to create more housing and bring people inside. Also, a big thank you to our sister agencies, especially the Washington State Patrol, Department of Transportation, for the continued work on the encampment resolution. We certainly couldn't do it without you. And thanks to my colleagues at the Department of Commerce as well. We know how to make affordable housing, and we know how to bring people inside. To meet those goals, it will take continued focus, including work with our state partners, local governments, housing and anti-poverty advocates, builders, affordable housing providers, and environmental groups. We need to continue land use changes to allow enough units to bring down the cost of housing for everyone. Continued support from local governments as they plan for and accommodate housing for all income levels and segments across our state. To support the coordination at the local and regional levels to continue to identify housing gaps. Infrastructure funding is needed to support infill development, especially in areas that can support sewer and transit systems. In any scenario, subsidized housing is a must, in particular, a need for housing with supported services for people who need more than a subsidy to stay stably housed. Subsidized housing can be addressed by working upstream, and the 10-year plan to dismantle poverty includes ideas that would directly address housing affordability, to include direct assistance cash, education, bringing lived experience to the policy-making process. We've got some great successes there, and we know that that will continue. Ensuring that people have meaningful access to services to be successful is also critical. Having identification is central. Department of Licensing, Department of Health, Department of Social and Health Services have been instrumental in helping to provide identification and benefits for people living in encampments, and is a model of wraparound services that's needed to continue. For the balance of needs that can't be met with land use changes alone, investments are essential to continue scaling up. Ideally, we need the federal government to step in and fulfill their role at scale, similar to the role that they have done with affordable health care. But we can't wait for the federal government to meet the urgent needs of housing today. To reach our goals, direct investments through the Housing Trust Fund, which we are grateful for, continue to bring people inside from encampments, and other housing stability programs need to continue growing because we must hold the gains. Continued exploration of deferred taxes and tax incentives that can make affordable housing projects pencil is another must. And finally, we need to continue to work on finding the right balance of tenant protections that provide renters predictability in costs and a fair process for evictions. Housing is foundational, but not enough. We need to build off the expansion of behavioral health supports and facilities enacted by Governor Inslee, including addressing opioids and further integrating those supports within our affordable housing systems. Washington can achieve these goals with focused investments at a scale necessary to make a bigger impact.
Before I pass it to you, sir, I would like to make a couple quick announcements. So, one, I'd like to invite you all to our next public performance review with Governor Inslee. It is on April 26th at Helen Somers Building. And our topic for that public performance review is Achieving Clean Energy Goals. And second, if you haven't had a moment, please do fill the survey. We'll greatly appreciate your feedback. And with that, sir, I'll pass it to you for your question, comment, and closing remarks.
Well, I think Diane summarized our situation. We have a model for success. We've had substantial success. We moved hundreds of people indoors, but we need to do more. And I think the clarion call is we need to continue this pace of investment. We also need to continue our efforts to site more of these facilities and deal with zoning challenges. So there's more work to be done in this state. But I think it ought to give us confidence that if we do make these investments, if we do increase our efforts to have a place to build more housing, we can succeed. People get into housing and they stay housed and they look, as Sarah does, get back on their feet, get a vocation, realize their ambitions. This works. And I have been so pleased to meet people who've had mental health challenges, who become much more stable when they get a little hand up. I've met many people who are beating their chemical addiction problems if we give them that therapy, if we give them a roof over their head so they can deal with their challenges. So I think the name of the game here is we're getting results in housing. We know what works. We need to continue it at scale. So I look forward to that, and I want to thank everybody working on this effort. It's a noble goal. It's a great state. It's getting greater, and thanks for your work.
Thank you, everyone.